When planning this second mechanical head, the first thing I did, as with the first mechanical head, is fill out one of our design sheets. I decided that I wanted a mechanical head that had stationary eyes, eyebrow movement, upper lip movement, a jaw that opened and closed, and a neck that would pivot in any direction. I decided to have an operator's hand inside the head to open and close the jaw and to move the neck. The type of base I chose for this mechanical head was a fiberglass underskull, and I'll explain why. As you recall, when building the first mechanical head, we started out with a plastic base and added mechanics onto that base. We'll then add a skin on top of the mechanics. We basically work from the inside of the head out. Now there may be times when you already have a sculpture or a skin already made and you need to fit mechanics inside of it or behind it. And the best type of base to use for that application is a fiberglass underskull. Now since a fiberglass underskull is custom molded to fit behind a skin, it's important for us to briefly go over how we make the skin so that you can better understand how we make the fiberglass underskull. To begin with, you start by making a sculpture of the head you're going to create. It's helpful if you can use the actual eyes in the sculpture that you'll be using in the mechanics. Next, you need to make a mold of your sculpture. The next thing you need to do is to line the inside of your mold with sheets of clay that you've rolled out to the exact thickness that you want your foam skin to be. The only areas of the mold that you do not coat with clay are the seats for the eyes and the registration keys. Once you've lined your mold with a layer of clay, you need to pour a core of the inside of the clay sheets. Once you've removed the core from the clay and cleaned the clay from the inside of the mold, the gap between the mold and the core created by the clay can be filled with foam latex to create a skin. Since the core was poured to conform to the shape of the clay sheets you had lining your mold, your core will fit perfectly behind the foam skin that you'll be creating. Therefore, you want your fiberglass underskull to be the exact same shape as the core, so it also fits perfectly behind the foam skin. To make a fiberglass duplicate of the core, you first need to make a latex mold of the core and a plaster bandage mother mold to help the latex mold hold its shape. You'll need to pick up some fiberglass resin and some fiberglass cloth at your local hardware store or auto parts store. You'll also need to cut up the fiberglass cloth into small square pieces. Next, remove the eyes from your clay sculpture and glue them into the sockets in the latex mold. Coat the whole inside of the mold with a thin layer of petroleum jelly. Then, mix up a small batch of fiberglass resin and paint it on the whole interior of the mold. Before the resin hardens, lay small squares of fiberglass cloth onto the resin and paint more resin onto the cloth to saturate it. Coat the whole inside of the mold in this way. When the fiberglass resin hardens, repeat this process several times to build up the thickness of the fiberglass underskull. Once the fiberglass has hardened, remove the mother mold, then peel the latex mold off of the fiberglass underskull. As you can see, this gives us a fiberglass duplicate of our core, with the eyes molded perfectly in place. Now, this whole process from sculpting to mold making can take quite some time. We would have liked to cover the subjects of sculpting and mold making in much more detail, but because the focus of this video is mechanics, we chose to only cover those subjects briefly. However, there are a number of fine how-to tapes on the market that cover these subjects in much more detail. Now let's take a look at how we finish the underskull. Once the underskull is trimmed using a sanding drum and a Dremel, the lower jaw is removed, also with the Dremel and a cutoff wheel. Using pieces of aluminum bar stock and small bolts, we created a hinge for the lower jaw so that it can be reattached to the head. Next, we poured more fiberglass resin into the back of the fiberglass underskull to reinforce the eyebrow area. Then, we cut away portions of the eyebrows and reattached them to the underskull in a way that would allow them to pivot. And we did this using 2 pieces of 1024 threaded rod. Eyebrow movement was controlled by attaching a casing to the outside of the fiberglass underskull and holding it in place with a piece of wire. The cable that runs through the casing was attached to the threaded rod on the back side of the eyebrow by a piece of wire with a bent loop on each end. Wires that will actually move the lips of the character were connected to the underskull and hinged using small bolts. The cable that will activate the lip movement was attached to the underskull using a small piece of wire to hold it in place. Holes were drilled between the eyes that will hold cables that will be attached to the backside of the foam skin. When small cables like these are pulled, very subtle facial expressions can be made. Wires were added to the inside of the skull and the jaw to create a handle for the operator's hand. The last thing that was done was to glue a PVC fitting on the inside of the skull. This will be used to connect the skull to a stand when it's not being used. As you can see, with the operator's hand inserted into the head, all kinds of interesting neck and jaw movement can be achieved. And by pulling on the cables, you can activate eyebrow movement, and upper lip movement. To finish this head, the eyes would need to be painted, teeth would need to be sculpted, cast, and attached to the underskull, and then the foam skin would need to be stretched onto the underskull and the mechanics attached to the inside of the skin. There are also many ways that you can modify the latex mold of your underskull before you cast fiberglass in it that can be very helpful when building mechanics. Here's an example. You can make a fiberglass underskull like this one that has a custom socket for a movable eye. You can drill a hole through this socket and then put a post on your eye and drop it into the socket. By moving the post inside the skull, you can move the eye. You can very easily create an underskull with eye sockets like this by simply gluing the eyes in place in the mold like we did earlier. Then, pack clay around the eye, only leaving a small portion of the actual eye exposed. Coat that exposed area with some petroleum jelly and then cast your fiberglass underskull as normal. When the fiberglass hardens, pull the underskull out, pop the eye out and clean the clay off the underskull, and there you'll have a custom eye socket. By blocking off portions of your mold with clay, you can create all kinds of interesting, helpful underskulls. You can also cast your fiberglass underskull around whole eye mechanisms that you've made earlier and then glued into your mold. As long as you remember to block off the portion of the mechanism that you don't want the fiberglass to come in contact with. As you can see, making fiberglass underskulls is very easy and it can be very effective when building mechanics. The good thing is, you can use this method for molds and masks that you already have made. Now let's take a look at our last mechanical head.